Welcome to the prophecy study, and today we're continuing with Revelation chapter 8, and we probably are going to be finishing chapter 8 this evening. And when we opened chapter 8 with the seventh seal, that was silence in heaven. The seventh seal actually introduces the trumpet series of judgments. The seals in general are indictments: death, conquering, famine, earthquakes. So those are just kind of general scenarios that are going along with the seals. The trumpets are going to be specific, and they're going to be terrible. The trumpets are worse than the seals. The bowls, which follow the trumpets, are even going to be worse than that. The first trumpet that we discovered last time was that it affected the land. 1/3 of the grass and the trees, 1/3 of the trees were burned up. We looked at the second trumpet already, and we found that that affects the oceans, turned it to blood. 1/3 of the ocean turned to blood. 1/3 of the sea creatures died, and also the ships. If you remember, there was perhaps a large meteorite or something that had hit into the water, and so maybe these ships got swamped with a tidal wave. So that was the second trumpet. And now we're coming up to the third trumpet. And so Revelation chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So there's a lot in these two verses, so we'll try to remember some of the highlights. We're going to be talking about the third angel, a great star, blazing like a torch, remember that, fell from the sky on 1/3 of the rivers, so this is fresh water and the springs of water. The name of the star was Wormwood, we'll talk about that. And 1/3 of the waters turned bitter. We'll talk about being bitter. And many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So those are some of the highlights. We'll look, but the scripture takes up the whole screen, so I'll have to refer back to some of it. So we're talking about the fresh water now, that it's coming upon the springs of the water and on the rivers. Now, it said that a great star fell from heaven. The word that is translated is aster, and we know we get certain words like astronomy and asteroids and things like that. And basically, it just means anything from space. So it may not be necessarily talking about a star. Understand, when these things were written in the Bible, we weren't that advanced in science. So when people looked up, they tend to call a lot of things. As a matter of fact, it really wasn't, I try not to get too sciencey, but it really wasn't until the early 1900s. Before the 1900s, there was a thing called the canopy theory, and what people up until the 1900s, like really about 100 years ago, people thought that the heavens, our atmosphere up there in the sky, was fixed like a ceiling. So if you had a spot on your ceiling, you can look at it every single day and the spot's not going to move. It's always going to stay right there. Well, as you look up into the sky, because from our vantage point, it doesn't look like the stars are moving, people thought those things were fixed. So anything up there, they basically called them all aster, which is just something from outer space. So when it says a star fell into the water, we should know that a star can't fall into the water. Our sun is a medium-sized star, and it's 93 million miles away, and it's hundreds of thousands of times the size of the Earth, hundreds of thousands of times larger than the Earth itself, so it can't hit. And so a star couldn't hit the Earth, but pieces of the star and meteorites and things like that can. So it also said that the star was burning like a torch. So if you think of a torch, it's got the flames coming off of it. And if you've ever seen a comet, you might have seen pictures on the internet or something like that. Not a lot of people have seen an actual comet, but they're not all that uncommon. And there's probably a couple of 3 a year that you can see. Some of them you have to have telescopes, but there are some that are almost visible with the naked eye, certainly with binoculars. But they would look like they have a tail. And obviously, people back in those days didn't have telescopes. Those didn't come around until 1500. But they could see some objects that looked like it had a tail. And so that's the same word for that is what they say was burning like a torch, because it looked like it had a tail. So that the word that comes from was a word that we get our word torch. And they use that same word in relation to meteors or comets. The name of the star was Wormwood, which is, are stars mentioned by name in the Bible? Are there any stars mentioned by names?
Well, constellations.
The Pleiades, yeah. But even then, I think some of the stars are, Orion is a constellation, Pleiades are, constellations. Constellation is a big group of stars that looks like a picture. So like Taurus looks like a bull, and then Cancer looks like a crab and stuff like that. But this is one of the few actual stars that is named, and it's called Wormwood. The word that's translated here, wormwood, is from the absinthe plant. And the absinthe plant, this is the only time it's mentioned in the New Testament. However, in the Old Testament, this word is actually, it's not translated wormwood, but the same word that in Revelation is translated wormwood is used in verses that talk about bitterness or poison or death, the absinthe. So from that plant, it's the same word, root word that we get wormwood from. To give you and speaking about wormwood, so Psalm 147:4 says, He determines the number of stars and calls them each by name. Now, if you ever want to get your mind blown, try to think about stuff in outer space. It's almost unfathomable to us and certainly could not be understood by the ancients. But there are 100, so science says that there are 100 billion galaxies, and each galaxy has 200 to 300 billion stars. So 200 to 300 billion stars per galaxy and 100 billion stars. How can God name or know the name of every star? I mean, I can't imagine even having that many words. But it says He determines the number of the stars and He calls them each by name. So He named this one Wormwood. Jeremiah, talking about bitter, Jeremiah 23:15, Therefore this is what the Lord Almighty says concerning the prophets. I will make them eat bitter food. This is the wormwood. I will make them eat bitter food and drink poisoned water. Because from the prophets of Jerusalem, ungodliness has spread throughout the land. So these are apostate prophets, people that are prophesying not from what God has said, but lying and prophesying from false gods and stuff like that. And so God says He's going to judge them by making them eat of the absinthe plant or drinking from water that has been poisoned by the absinthe plant. So this is where you get that. Now, water is sometimes used as a reference to people. So again, going back to our friends that tend to see a lot of symbolism and things like that in the Bible, they will say that these waters are representing people. Revelation itself, in chapter 17, Then the angel said unto me, The waters you saw, not talking about these waters. This is a totally different in chapter 17, and we'll talk about it again. But this is not the same water, but just to show you that he uses water for people. The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So yes, sometime God does refer to waters as multitude of people, and we'll actually see this a few more times as we go through Revelation. So yes, I will give some expositors that, but I don't believe in this case when the star hits the water that it's talking about people. I believe, especially where it's talking about the ships and the sea creatures, it's talking about the real sea. All right, so that's trumpet 3. Trumpet 4 is now upon us, and in verse 12, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. Now, maybe you're thinking, and thank you for not asking me the question because I don't know the answer. Why a third? I don't know. I do know that when Satan fell, he took a third of the angels with him, but why a third of this? Do all these things represent the third of the angels that fell? I don't know. I mean, I guess you could tie it in, but I can't imagine anybody being dogmatic. And why a third and not a quarter or a half or 2/3 or whatever? I really don't know. And I've not read any commentaries where anybody has even ventured a guess as to why it's a third. But it is showing that God has a plan. He has numbers. These things are not random. And put that down on your list of things that you're going to ask God when you see him in heaven. How come a third? So here, the fourth angel is now going to be affecting the sun, the moon, and the stars. So we've seen the fresh water, we've seen the ocean water, we've seen the land, and now we see the heavens are all going to be affected, and it doesn't matter where they were, it was still a third of this and a third of that. Isaiah 13, 9 through 10, talking about the heavens being affected. See the day of the Lord, and again, we looked at this, if you didn't remember, back in Isaiah when we looked at Isaiah 13. See the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day. Quite often, a day of the Lord is considered the day of judgment. And it starts from the rapture. Anything that happened after the rapture to the end of the millennium can all be put into the category of the day of the Lord. And so the day of the Lord is just including the judgments, so it could be any time period in there. So it was not, it has to come after the rapture. So as Isaiah was talking of this, he wasn't talking of the day of the Lord. In other words, when we say something happened in AD 20, that's Anno Domingo, the year of the Lord. That's not what he's talking about here, the time of Jesus' birth. He is talking about a day of the Lord being future prophecy, future even to us at this time. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. So this very well could have been right around this time period that Isaiah was talking about. Ezekiel talks about it in 32, 7 through 8. When I snuff you out, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heaven I will darken over you, and I will bring darkness over the land, declares the sovereign Lord. So the interesting thing about Ezekiel is a big fat book. It's one of the major prophets. And in the book of Ezekiel, God is having Ezekiel prophesy to not only Israel, but the nations around it. And he's telling Edom, and he's telling Assyria, and he's telling Egypt, and he's telling Tyre and Sidon, and Aram, and Edom, and a lot of these lands that are around Israel. He's telling them, you have oppressed my people, judgment is coming for you. And then he also is talking, Ezekiel is talking about the judgments of the nation Israel. And so he goes all through these judgments of all the lands around Israel, including Israel itself. And then he gets into, you may remember, the story of the dry bones. And because that's in Ezekiel 37, in Ezekiel 36, he starts, so all this is in Ezekiel 32. And he's been chapter after chapter of, watch out, you people, including Israel, because you've not been listening to me. And then in Ezekiel 36, he starts talking about the remnant. And there will be a time when I am going to call you back to be my own. And then he gets into chapter 37, and Ezekiel talks about the dry bones. And when he talks about the dry bones, the valley of dry bones that he saw, he says that they're going to be knit together. And they're going to be, he said, Ezekiel, take 2 sticks and put them together. That symbolized, at this time when Ezekiel was talking, there was northern Israel, which was known as Israel, and then southern Israel, which was known as Judah. And they were separate, and they will never come together again until the millennium. And that's when Ezekiel took the 2 sticks, put them together, and made them one. So around the chapter 36 starts talking about healing Israel, and then he talks to 37, he talks about the dry bones and about Israel now coming together. And then Ezekiel 38, if you remembered when we talked about that, that was what was talking about Russia, Gog and Magog, and we made talked about Ukraine at that time. And then right after that, it's talking about the final war. And then we're getting ready to head into the millennium. And then in Ezekiel 39 and 40, he starts talking about the New Jerusalem. And he actually takes a measurement stick and he starts measuring the New Jerusalem with its gates and its foundations, and actually the temple. So that's all Ezekiel. So when we put that all together, now when we're looking at Revelation, we can see a clearer picture now that we're in Revelation of what Ezekiel was talking about in his book of prophecy. And so now we're getting a better, clearer understand, and that should help us understand the valley of the dry bones, because that is calling them together, which is what is going to happen during the millennium. And it says that it's going to have, Israel is going to be lush again, and it is going to be producing a lot of food because people are going back to it. And so we're now starting to see some of the previous things that we looked at now that we're in Revelation come to be. So let's look at Jesus' prophecy. We also talked about Jesus' prophecies. And again, now we're seeing what Jesus said in Luke 21 now coming to pass as we're reading Revelation. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. That's what we just read with the 4th trumpet. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and the tossing of sea. 1/3 of the ships are now destroyed. On earth, the nations will be anguish. And remember that in the seal judgment, they wanted the rocks to fall upon them just before the silence in heaven, getting ready for prayer. So these things, Jesus said these things are going to happen. And he very well was probably talking about this point in Revelation. In Mark 13:24, he put it a different way. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be but darkened, and the moon will not give its light. So he didn't mention stars here, but again, he's probably talking about this same time where some of these things are going to be blotted out. And then verse 13, closing out Revelation chapter 8. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other three angels. So here we are at the end of the fourth trumpet. So we've had 4 trumpets already, and now we're going to have 3 more trumpets, so there'll be 7, and these are separate. Remember, I told you the trumpets are getting worse. The things on earth are getting worse as we go along, and so now it is calling even more attention to the last 3 trumpets. You know, it was bad before, it's getting even worse. So the eagle is a divine symbol descriptive of the heavens. We have looked, I don't know how many times, Daniel, Ezekiel, a number of the different prophets talk about the different faces of the creatures, and quite often there's a face of an eagle, and sometimes that represents divine, sometimes it's a kingly type of thing, depending on what the other faces are. But here, this eagle flying in midair, representing the heavens, is a judgment coming again from God to the earth. Most likely, this is a voice. So remember, as I watched, I heard an eagle calling out in a voice, "Woe, woe, woe," to the inhabitants, and so forth and so on. So he's now hearing, John is now hearing a voice. Now, most likely, this is a voice like at Pentecost, where everyone heard in their own language. Remember, Peter was preaching, and it goes through, and I don't remember how many nations were there. There were people from Cyprus, there were people from this nation, and Galatia, and Asia Minor, and all these different places. And remember, they heard Peter preaching, and they all heard in their in their own language. So here now is a voice that I'm assuming everybody is going to understand. I know it doesn't say this, but based on what we've seen in Acts, this can happen. A voice can now appear to come to many people different languages, and they all understand it. So, you know, it's not like, and I know, and these are fanciful discussions, and I know I've heard pastors and Bible teachers say that the language in heaven is going to be Hebrew. Some have said it's going to be Aramaic. I think it's going to be a totally different language, nothing like you've heard here on earth, but yet all people are going to be able to understand it. You don't have to study it to understand it. It's one of these new things that God will just give us in our spiritual body. So this voice crying, "Woe, woe, woe," I believe is going to be heard and understood by everybody on earth. So note that the woe, woe, woe. And as we've gone through prophecy studies, and maybe you've heard it before, if you haven't heard it, I'll repeat it. If you haven't heard, sorry, you know, you've heard this before. But the Greek language, when we say Jim runs fast, Dennis runs faster, but Michael runs the fastest. Okay, so we use fast, faster, fastest. Greek doesn't have those endings, so those suffixes. And so what they do is they repeat it. Woe, woe, woe. So in other words, this is going to be woe to the highest degree. Just like we heard, when did we see one of those things repeated three times? Only the opposite. Not woe, but what do the angels say? Holy, holy, holy. So in other words, God is the holiest. This is, you know, to the highest degree. Now this is the exact opposite. This is woe to the highest degree. So what we're going to see out of the last 3 trumpets are called the woe trumpets. And like I said, they're going to get worse. So these are going to be exponentially worse than the trumpets that we've just seen, where 1/3 of the people die, 1/3 of the grass is, that's a lot on the size of the earth. But now things are even actually going to get worse. It talks about those who dwell on the earth. When the term is used, those who dwell on the earth, and there's actually quite a few instances in the Bible of this, they're talking about the lost. They are not talking about saved people. For one thing, this is not going to affect those that got saved, because remember, the 144,000 are still operating. People are still getting saved, and yet these woes are not going to, or the other trumpets, are not going to affect them. Like we saw in chapter 6 and verse 10 of Revelation, they called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" So this inhabitants of the earth, these are the people that are going to be judged, and vengeance is going to be poured out on the inhabitants of the earth. So this is an example just from a couple chapters ago about how the inhabitants of the earth are recognized as the lost, because the saved people, the people of God, are not going to be the ones that have vengeance brought out on them. So inhabitants of the earth.
So the people that got saved during the tribulation, they're going to be touched by...
Hold that thought for a second. I'm getting there. So anyway, inhabitants of the earth are the lost. Here are some others. These are all from the book of Revelation. 11:10 talks about the inhabitants of the earth, and you would see it was the lost. Chapter 13, verse 8, verse 12, and verse 14. And then chapter 17, verses 2 and 8 also talk about the inhabitants of the earth being the lost. The three woe trumpets are about to come. I thought I answered that question. Actually, I'm going to answer that question when we get to chapter 9. So the question was, what about the saved people that got saved by the 144,000? And I'll give you a spoiler for when we get into chapter 9, seeing as you asked the question. So if you remember, one of the things that we said is that we are seeing here in Revelation a lot of similarities to the plagues that happened in Egypt. And when Moses went in and said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh said no, and then, he did all these things, and blood and frogs and pestilence and darkness and eventually death. All those things were plagues that plagued the Pharaoh. And I don't know if you know this or remember this from those times, but the slaves, the Israelite slaves, they didn't live amongst the Egyptians. They lived in a town called Goshen. And when the cattle started getting all these sores on them and dying, didn't happen to the cattle that lived in Goshen. The blood on the land, the waters of the Niles turned into blood, not in Goshen. That's where God's people lived. So God's people were amongst the Egyptians, all surrounded all around them, and the plagues hit all of Egypt around the land of Goshen and did not affect the people of Goshen. So this was, or if you want to look at it, I'm probably giving too much away for next time, but if you want to look at the Noah version, Noah and his family, how many people on the ark? 8, okay. So 8 people on the ark. They were saved as all the destruction goes all the way around them. They were saved. And so now the question is asked, what about the saved people while these things are happening? They're not part of the third. They are not being affected. God is protecting them like he did the Israelites in Goshen, and like he did Noah and his family on the ark, but not so all around it. So that's kind of, we'll get to that again when we get into Revelation chapter 9. So that is our message for today. Trumpets number 3 and 4, 5, 6, and 7 are going to be called woe trumpets. You don't want to miss them because it's getting pretty bad. And we are going to be in Revelation 9 next time. So thank you for joining me on this prophecy study. And until we meet again, may God richly bless you.